Hi, my name is Emerson Aitino,
And I'm Likeke Lakar, and we are students of Wailo High and Intermediate School.
and we are doing the documentary on the attack on Pearl Harbor. Why was the U.S. so unprepared for the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941? On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft and submarines attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet in the base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The fleet was devastated and it was padlocked that the most important ship in the fleet, the U.S. aircraft carriers, were out at sea. Why was the USA taken so completely by surprise?
The December disaster at Pearl Harbor. This is how the great American naval base looked after waves of Japanese bombers had carried out their stab in the back raid. The battleship Arizona and four other warships destroyed. The air base on the island and large numbers of aircraft bombed and burned out in one devastating, treacherous blow. Japan's vicious attempt to cripple the American Pacific Fleet before any declaration of war. Taken by surprise, the fighter aircraft at Hickam Field and Wheeler Field had little chance of engaging the enemy bombers, who were thus able to wreak their destruction almost unhampered. By 1941, Japan was a dominating force in Asia. It invaded Manchuria in northeast China in 1931 and then moved deeper into the country in 1937. By July 1941, Japan had flooded French Indochina, now known as Vietnam, with Japanese troops. It intended to use these territories as a platform to take control of British territories like Malaya and Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the US dominated Philippines. After Pearl Harbor, this plan worked very effectively. At one point, it seemed that even Australia might be under threat from invasion. This source is an extract from a report by a British naval officer soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The officer clearly believed that the Japanese citizens living in and around Pearl Harbor could not be trusted. He was concerned that Japanese citizens in the British possession of Singapore might act as agents for a Japanese attack here. This source is an extract from an interview with Captain Mitsuo Fuchida of the Japanese Navy that took place after the war had ended. After Japan surrendered in September 1945, intelligence officers went through Japanese records and interviewed Japanese officers about key events in the war to see what lessons they could learn. By the time the war ended, Fuchida was a senior officer in the Japanese Navy. He led Japanese attacks on Darwin, Australia, and also Sri Lanka. By 1944, he was a staff officer, helping the plan strategy for the whole Japanese Navy. Fuchida was also interviewed about the Japanese use of kamikaze attacks later in the war. Kamikaze pilots flew aircraft loaded with explosives and crashed them into enemy ships. These extracts come from an American report produced in 1945 on what happened at Pearl Harbor and who was responsible. An American officer had produced an earlier report in 1944 but saw no evidence in 1945 to change his mind. World War II broke out in Europe in 1939. The U.S. was neutral in the early stages of the war, although it was clear that U.S. President Roosevelt was no friend of Nazi Germany or its ally Japan. In Japan, hardline military commanders had become increasingly powerful during the 1930s. Japan had built up an empire in Asia, and these leaders wanted Japan to become an Asia's leading power. They knew that U.S. would stand in their way and that war with America would happen sometime. They decided to try and knock out the U.S. fleet in the Pacific. The plan was to buy time to build up their resources in the Pacific so that Japan would be ready to take on the U.S. once it recovered from the attack at Pearl Harbor. There were large numbers of Japanese settlers in Hawaii in 1941. Some were Japanese immigrants, but far more were descendants of immigrants and were therefore American citizens. Even so, around 12,000 Japanese Americans were placed in camps during the war.
Almost as soon as the attack occurred, claiming that President Roosevelt had prior knowledge of the assault on Pearl Harbor, others have claimed he tricked the Japanese into starting a war, with the United States as a backdoor way to go to war with the Japanese ally Nazi Germany. However, after nearly 65 years, no document or credible witness had been discovered that proved either claims. Most scholars view Pearl Harbor as the consequence of missed clues, intelligent errors, and overconfidence. The cause behind the Japanese attacks are complex and dated back to the 1930s when Japanese undertook a military colony expansion in China. In a full-scale invasion in 1937, America opposed this expansion and used a variety of methods to try to deter Japan. During the late 1930s, FDR began proving limited support to the Chinese government. In 1940, Roosevelt moved the Pacific Fleet in the naval base at Pearl Harbor, as shown as of American power. Japan chose to continue its diplomatic talk with the United States while at the same time secretly preparing for a coordinated assault throughout the Pacific. Japan's leader hopes that a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor would destroy American resolve and cripple the American Navy for at least 6 months, giving Japan time to consolidate its new empire. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt gave his speech.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Here is where we got all of our sights at.
If President Roosevelt had prior knowledge of the assault on Pearl Harbor, why didn't he try to inform the naval Pacific Fleet of this treacherous attack on Pearl Harbor, which could have prevented the lives of more than 2,000 military personnel and others who were killed on the morning of December 7, 1941?
And this is the documentary on the attack on Pearl Harbor.